Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm a Boeing 737 pilot and a member of PMDG's tech team. Today we're going to talk about doing takeoff, landing and weight and balance calculation using Boeing's onboard performance tool. And for that, since PMDG has at the moment of this recording not yet their own EFB available, we'll have to use the virtual performance tool, which is a very nice tool that you can find on virtualperformancetool.com. Now, it is a paid subscription, however, I really think it's worth it because the takeoff and landing calculations make such a big part of our operation and they will help you to achieve better performance in your own flight simulator as well. Now, Virtual Performance Tool designed their app exactly around the Boeing onboard performance tool that my airline is using in the EFB, and therefore I can really recommend you to try this out. In this video, I'm going to give you a couple of tips and tricks how we do things with the onboard performance tool and how we do our weight and balance calculation. So, this is the welcoming screen that you see in the VPT once you have logged in. And we want to try the VPT app over here. Now, the first thing we want to do when we open this is to select the aircraft type that we want to use. So we'll go and select new aircraft. And at the moment it only supports the 737-800, but the 700 is already in development. Basically, what you see over here, the upmost one is the 737-800 without winglets, the W is the one with winglets, and the WSFP is the short field performance kit. Now, check in the PMDG options in your flight simulator if you have a short field performance aircraft. If you do, you need to select the SFP version. If you don't, you select the standard winglet version, since there is no aircraft without winglet available for the PMDG at the moment of this recording. Now, let's say, for example, we want to take the standard aircraft without short field performance kit today. We go on here, then we have to decide if we want to use FAA or EASA performance rules. We'll go for EASA, and then we have to check if we have steel or carbon brakes. And again, you can check that in the PMDG options inside your flight simulator. So for today, we'll go for the steel brakes over here. This finally leads us to our takeoff dispatch calculations. Now, let's take a quick example. We'll take a flight from Düsseldorf to Palma de Mallorca in a 737-800. Now, this works pretty much the same for any 737 version, so you can do the same in the 700, 600 or 900, or even in the Boeing business jets. So, as our departure airport, we'll go for Düsseldorf, and today we'll have runway 23 left. Now, it's always a good thing to calculate for some intersection takeoffs, just in case air traffic control might give them to you. On this particular runway, we'll take Lima 3, and this is ordered from the longest takeoff distance at the top, going to the shortest at the bottom. So basically, if you want to take the most conservative figures, just go for the lowest option. However, it does make sense to check the airfield chart to see which intersections would actually make sense for you. We got the meta on the side over here. That, by the way, is a feature of the virtual performance tool only. The actual Boeing performance tool does not have this, so we'd have to take our values from the ATIS. However, if we can use this, we can see the runway is going to be dry. And for the wind, we always want to take the most conservative wind. So we have the base wind here of 300 degrees at 4 knots, but it's variable between 240 and 050. Now, we want to take the most limiting factor for our performance calculation, so we'll go with 050 since that is basically straight tailwind. So we'll take a wind of 050 with 4 knots. For the temperature, it's going to be 17 degrees, and then for the QNH, 1023. For the we'll take optimum. That defines which thrust rating we want to use on our engines. Now, if you define, for example, 22 here, you could enter an assumed temperature over here. Now, assumed temperature is the Boeing name for flex temperature, as many of you will probably know it. Anyway, the default option is optimum. We're going to use that. And the wind shear option is basically to be used when you are encountering or rather when there is reported or forecast wind shear, or for example when there are very strong gusts and some wind shear can be expected. Now that comes down to the pilot in command to determine if he wants to use wind shear conditions or not, in case there is no wind shear reported. So for now, we'll just go for optimum. Flaps, we do have an optimum top available here. In that case, it's going to calculate for the least fuel usage. However, we have to keep in mind that tail clearance is reducing if we take less flap setting. So we can define a default over here in the settings, and that is going to be flap 5 as my airline is doing it in real life. Air conditioning, we can decide if it's either going to be on or off, anti-ice, off, engine and wing, and then improved climb, whether we want to put it off or on. Improved climb by default is going to be off, and you would only use that when you are actually takeoff weight limited and you want to increase your performance limited takeoff weight. Anti-ice, short word on here because it can be a little bit confusing. Basically, in the 737NG, you would always select both engine and wing anti-ice on in your cockpit before you start the taxi in icing conditions. However, when you set takeoff thrust, the wing anti-ice is automatically going to be switched off. And the setting you are going to use in the onboard performance tool here actually depends on whether you intend to put the wing anti-ice on again after takeoff. So in the vast majority of circumstances, you are not going to put the wing anti-ice on again after takeoff. You would only do that if you expect, for example, some strong icing conditions after your takeoff. In most occasions, that is not the case. So even though you are selecting engine and wing anti-ice on for your takeoff performance calculation, you will in most cases only use the engine option for the calculation itself. Alright, anyway, today we have 17 degrees centigrade, so we are going to turn engine anti-ice off. Now, this moment you click the calculate button, and then it calculates your performance limited takeoff weight. That's the one you want to see down here. So in our case, it's 73,663 kilograms. So that is our performance limited takeoff weight. Now, the structural limited weight for the aircraft we've selected is 74,990 kilograms, so we can see that we cannot depart from this runway under these conditions at our maximum theoretical takeoff weight. Now, if we wanted to change that, the first option, of course, would be just to select the full runway. And if we do that, we can see we get our full takeoff weight over here. Now, you could go ahead and try the different intersections to see which one is most limiting, and therefore to calculate which intersection you can use or which intersection you cannot use, provided your takeoff weight would be higher than this. Now, 73.6 tons still is a high takeoff weight, so I'm going to leave it at Lima 3 over here. But this basically gives you an idea of the limiting factors that you have available in your runway. Of course, up here you can also enter NOTAMs. For example, if you have a takeoff shortening from the runway start, from the liftoff end, and you can do adjustments to all of your different values for that runway. Going to cancel this today. Similar, we can select different items from the minimum equipment list. For example, air conditioning. If there was an air conditioning pack in up, we could select that over here. And then the OPT would take account for that at all times. Going further in the pre-flight procedure, we have to calculate our landing dispatch performance. So we're going to Palma de Mallorca. That's Lima Echo Papa Alpha. Looking at the weather over here, it's 070 at 1 knot. So they have a preferential runway system there for 2.4, so let's take runway 2.4 left. Missed approach gradient 2.5 is the standard. However, some approaches offer different minimums for different missed approach gradients. If you wanted to select the minimum, or if you wanted to select the lowest minimum, then there would probably be a higher gradient than 2.5. So then you could go on enter gradient and you could just enter the missed approach gradient over here. Now, for this one, we'll take 2.5. The runway condition is dry, the wind is 070 at 1. Outside air temperature, 27 already. We can see on the forecast it's going up to 34 degrees. So we want to calculate conservative, so I'll take the 34 degrees over here. And our QNH is 1016. Flap config. You can choose between 30 or 40 since those are the normal landing flap settings. For this one, I'm going to take flaps 40 because it will give us the greatest landing weight. And similarly, we can choose if the air conditioning is going to be auto or off, which anti-ice we're going to use, and if we have auto speed brake or if we may have manual speed brakes, and of course for the thrust reversers, we'll have to choose if we have one inoperative, all operative, or no credit. For the dispatch calculation, I would always go for no credit because we want to do conservative calculations over here. So right now it's calculated that we have a landing weight of 65,317 kilos, which is the maximum landing weight certified on the 737-800. Now, I know that some of you will say, but there are higher certifications. And yes, that's true. However, those are not the standards. The standard 65317. Now, that is basically the preparation that you are going to do in the pre-flight phase of the flight. Now, at some point, the dispatcher is going to come in and bring you your load instruction document. And then we go on to the weight and balance tab. And there is actually a great little feature in here that the guys at Virtual Performance Tool have come up with, which I'm going to get to in a moment. Before we, however, go to actually entering our passenger numbers, let's quickly have a look at the setup of the airplane itself. You can select over here between different configurations. So, for example, you have real-life 737-800 with winglet configuration. Then you have the PMDG configuration, different Zibo configurations, ProSim and Zim avionics. Now, for this tutorial, I'm going to choose the real-life configurations. However, you should select whichever aircraft is applicable to what you're doing in the flight simulator. Now, placard weight over here is our takeoff placard weight. Some airlines are using a variable weight system, so if you know that your takeoff weight is going to be less than, for example, 66,990 kilos, you would change it to 66,990, and then basically your airline will have to pay less cost for flying at a certain airport or for air traffic control. Just a little money saving measures. We go on over here, flight crew, that's the number of pilots in the cockpit. By default it's 2, however it could for example be 3 or 4 because you have up to 2 jump seats available. The PMDG 737 is 1 jump seat, so for example if you were doing a line check or if there was a new cadet being trained, there might be a safety pilot on the jump seat, so then you might select higher numbers. Similarly for the cabin crew, 4 is the default since that is what is required for most 737s. Now, of course, you may operate with a reduced number of a cabin crew, up to 0 if you were doing a ferry flight. And since there can be additional cabin crew, for example, new cabin crews in training, you can select up to 6, which is the number of cabin crew jump seats available in the cabin. For our flight, we'll stick with 2 and 4. Catering, that is something that has to be updated by your airline. For example, in here we have a winter catering for 2021. Then we have 2 different types, Alpha and Bravo, which basically consist of a different food or different perfumes or whatever your airline might be selling. We'll just go with a Winter 21 Alpha in here, and then you have to select if duty free is loaded. Basically, if you were doing a flight that's going to leave the Schengen area for the European friends among us. For example, if you were flying from Germany to the Canary Islands where you have a long flight over the Atlantic Ocean, or if you were to fly to the United Kingdom, then your airline would probably have duty-free loaded, while if you were doing a flight inside Europe or inside the Schengen area, you would probably not have duty-free loaded because you were not allowed to sell it. For flight simming purposes, usually nil duty-free is going to do, and you can see here when you are loading duty-free how the zero fuel weight is changing already. So this makes some 40 kilos of difference, which basically is the 4 duty-free boxes loaded in the aft galley usually. Now going on, told you earlier that we have this cool feature in here. So on the passenger tab, you would enter your numbers of adult, children, infants and supernumeraries. Now, if we go on Virtual Dispatcher over here, then Virtual Performance Tool is actually able to calculate a load instruction document for us. Now, it already takes the from to and the date of the flight from the first page, but if we just go on SimBrief over here, then it's automatically going to import our SimBrief data and going to calculate the load instruction document for us. And that is something I found really, really cool. And the best thing it does over there is it takes the SimBrief values and then it deducts a certain number of passengers from it. Because in real life, we are always missing some 10 to 15% of the booked passenger numbers. So for example, if we have a flight fully booked with 189 seats, then we might easily be missing like 15 passengers who just didn't show up for the flight. And this is taken into account by Virtual Performance Tool over here. And it now tells us, for this flight, I believe in SimBrief I planned like 165 passengers. And now what it does over here is it's calculating that we have 134 adults, 9 children, 3 infants, and no supernumeraries. And it also tells us the distribution of the passengers in the different parts of the cabin. And going further down in here, we see how many bags and what the bag weight is we have in the different holds. Now, due to the way I've set up my SimBrief, it didn't give me any number of bags in here, but I've simply selected 1,100 kilos of cargo, which represents my bag weight. Also, it tells me some supplementary information, and in this case it tells me we have 1 PRM on board. Now, PRM is persons with reduced mobility, and that could be, for example, wheelchair passengers. And that's exactly the kind of information that we get on our real-life load instruction documents. Now, when we get this document, the captain would fill out the call sign up here. So, for example, we could say we are going to be flight Air Berlin, let's say 592 Romeo. And down here, the captain basically has to sign that everything has been carried out in accordance with the law. If you click on here, it's going to insert your name, and then you can just sign it down here. That's a really cool feature. And you can print this on the top over here. So, for example, you could save it as a PDF to have this available, or you could print it out on your printer. And then basically what we do with these documents, we are basically folding them together so that they show us our call sign as a reminder, our number of passengers on board, and then the total heads on board on the airplane. And this serves some very good reference. For example, if first of all you have the call sign that you're using all along the flight, but then, for example, if you have an emergency happening and the air traffic controllers are asking you, so report number of souls on board, you can quickly check it on here on the lid. Now, going from here, in real life, we would type those numbers into the OPT. Now in here, you can just click on Load OPT, and then it's automatically filling them out for you.
Have a nice flight.
And basically now it has automatically inserted the number of passengers, the amount of cargo that you have. The adjust tab is more or less not used because, at least in my airline, whenever we are entering those numbers and we have a last minute change, we would just change it on here and not on the adjust tab. For the fuel, you'll have to enter the numbers from SimBrief. Now these have also been automatically imported when I got my SimBrief information from the virtual dispatcher. Of course, in real life, we'd have to change this. And something that you have to have a look at here is the total amount of fuel on board, because chances are this is taking the exact value from SimBrief. Chances are that if you are using the refueling function in your flight simulator, you will have rounded it up. So, for example, if we have 8,178 kilos planned, then we might have loaded 8,200 kilos of fuel. So you got to put this in. Down here, you can check the flight envelope, and you can also make this a little bit bigger if you like. Going on from here, if you were flying in a multi-crew environment, you would now read out the different weights so that both the captain and the first officer can compare the weights they have. Now, since we automatically imported our SimBrief data, that is not really as important in our flight simulator. But if you were to fly, for example, in a multi-crew environment, in case a shared cockpit function comes out in the future, then you would read out taxi weight 62,991, takeoff weight 62,821, landing weight 57,732, zero fuel weight 54,791. And the other pilot would cross-check that they have the same numbers, and my airline actually requires us to have the same numbers to the exact kilogram. So if there was any difference, you would check why. In most cases, for example, you might have a typo in the cargo, or you might have a typo in the distribution of the passengers and stuff like that. Anyway, going on from here, you'll take your zero fuel weight, and this would be rounded up to 55.8. You would compare that to the estimated zero fuel weight from your operational flight plan that you have already prepared in the performance init page in your flight management computer, and then you would figure out why there is a difference, if there is any. Now, I told you earlier on that usually not all passengers are showing up for a flight, and that virtual performance tool reflects this when importing the SimBrief values. So, for example, you might have 55.3 tons of zero fuel weight in your FMC, and you are going to enter 54.8 here. You'll come out with a difference of 500 kilos. Now, you can see up here that the passenger weight is basically 81 kilos used by VPT, and a difference of 500 kilos might therefore amount to approximately what's that, like 8 passengers missing or something. And then you would compare the number that your operational flight plan has been based on with the number that you've got on here from the lid. Figure out why there is a difference and if you can explain the difference, because if you can't explain the difference, then it's indicative of a load sheet error. And in that case, you'd have to talk to the dispatcher again. Now, we'll just insert the 54.8 in the zero fuel weight box then, and then our Boeing also gives us the gross weight on the first left column on the performance init page, and that has to be within basically 200 kilos of the taxi weight. So if we are showing basically 63 tons over here and your FMC would be showing you 63.2, that would be within limits. Now, if your FMC would be showing you, for example, 62.0, then you would know that there is a setup problem with your FMC. So, for example, the fuel quantity might not be correct. So once you have these numbers determined and entered into the performance page, you can execute the performance page in the FMC, and then you go back to the takeoff dispatch page, and you will see that now it has automatically filled out the takeoff weight and the takeoff CG. You would once again check the values you have inserted on the takeoff dispatch page and read them out aloud so that the other pilot can cross-check with what they have entered. Then you click on calculate, and now it's basically giving you the most optimal calculation for your flight. So we can see we've got a flap 5 takeoff with a minimum flap retraction altitude of 1,147 feet. The takeoff run available is 2,235 meters, and this one you carefully have to compare to the other pilot because it does happen with a real onboard performance tool. And I don't know if this is simulated in virtual performance tool, but with a real onboard performance tool, you sometimes get an incorrect takeoff run available figure, and then you would have to recalculate. So compare the TORA with what the other pilot has. And then in here we've got a 22K takeoff at 34 degrees of assumed temperature. Now, we have to determine if we can actually use assumed temperature, because there are several limitations on the usage of assumed temperature by Boeing. Now, for flight simulation, basically there are two things that you have to take into consideration. And that is, first of all, you may not use assumed temperature if the crosswind exceeds 10 knots. Now, up on the wind field over here, we can see that when we have entered the actual wind, it's going to calculate the tailwind component and the crosswind component resulting from this wind. So in our case, we have 4 knots of tailwind, 0 knots of crosswind. Now keep in mind the wind has been variable between 240 and 050, so it is possible that in the worst case scenario you are going to have a direct 4 knots crosswind with this wind forecast on a runway of 23. So, since it's only 4 knots, we don't have to take it into account. But if it was higher, then you will have to think about how strong your crosswind component might be. And if it's more than 10 knots, you would select the full rating over here, and then it's going to give you a full 22K takeoff without assumed temperature. Since in our case, however, the maximum crosswind is only 4 knots, we can use assumed temperature. So now you would enter this on the N1 limit page in the FMC, and then calculate or compare the N1 that your FMC is going to calculate. So 90.6 in here with the N1 that has been pre-computed by your FMC. Now you have to be aware that the FMC's N1 is probably different from the N1 that's been calculated by Virtual Performance Tool. And there's a reason for that. First of all, acceptable differences are within approximately 0.1 or 0.2% N1. If it's more than this, then you'll have to figure out the difference. Now, if you are flying an aircraft without an aspirated TAT probe, then you will probably have to enter the temperature manually on the N1 limit page. And if you are entering an incorrect temperature, of course that is going to make a difference in the N1 calculated. So make sure that the temperature on the N1 limit page equals the temperature that you have in the takeoff dispatch calculations. And then we have to keep in mind that this is calculated with the air conditioning in automatic mode. So air conditioning is going to be on for our takeoff. The FMC, however, doesn't know if you want to have the air conditioning on or off. So what it's doing, it's looking at the duct pressure, and basically when there is no pressure in the air conditioning system, it thinks that you want to fly with the air conditioning off. And then it's also going to adjust the N1 for that. And that might, for example, be the case if you are standing on the apron on the ground power or on the APU, but without the APU bleed and the packs being turned on or auto, respectively. So that usually makes a difference of 0.6 N1 when you have a takeoff that's using both the fixed D rate of 22K and an assumed temperature. It's usually 0.7 if you only have a fixed D rate, and 0.8 if you're on full 26K. Going on from here, there is also another reason, just to mention that quickly. When you are on full 22K, so for example, your performance tool would give you full 22K, but now you have more than 10 knots of crosswind. Then you would manually have to select the rating to 24K and calculate for a full 24K. In that case, keep in mind you cannot use assumed temperature here. So if your result would be a full 22K takeoff, then you'd go 24K, calculate, select full, and then use the full 24K values. Also, there is one more restriction. If you have de-iced your aircraft on the ground, then you have to take at least a full 24K takeoff. So the onboard performance tool is not going to take that into account automatically. If you do a calculation with an optimum rating, and it can always give you 22K, regardless whether you have de-iced or not. So if you have de-iced, first of all, you're going to do the optimum calculation to figure out if it might, for example, want to do a 26K takeoff. But if it gives you 22K, or 24K with an assumed temperature reduction, or 22K with an assumed temperature reduction, then you're manually going to change this to 24K. Hit calculate, select full, and that are the numbers that you are going to use. So we're going back to our case in here with 17 degrees and little crosswind, so we can use the 22K takeoff. So now you would go on to the takeoff reference page, enter your flap setting, so flap 5, enter your CG, 18.5, and then compare the automatically calculated takeoff trim setting from the FMC with the setting that you have from the OPT in here. So it has to be within 0.25 units of takeoff trim, otherwise you'll have to determine why there is a difference. So for example, your FMC might give you 6.01 units, OPT gives you 6.25, then you can use 6.2 and a bit. You can't set it as precisely in the 737 anyway, so you just go slightly above the 6 marker. When you start the trimming, this is going to take a while, so that's a good moment to enter the takeoff speeds. You are going to compare the 3 speeds that the onboard performance tool has given you with the speeds that the FMC has calculated for you. And when we do this, we basically end up within 1 knot of the calculated speeds. Then you can use the FMC predicted takeoff speeds. So you can just line select them on the takeoff reference page then and forget about the numbers from the OPT. But when there is more than 1 knot of a difference, first of all determine why there is a difference. For example, the FMC is always going to do a balanced field takeoff, and it assumes it has full runway length available. But if you have calculated with an intersection over here, like we have, then your takeoff run available might be shorter than what the FMC has in its internal database. So then you might get a different V1 value. And in that case, the OPT values always take precedence over the FMC values, so you would go for 137 knots V1, VR, and V2 as per the OPT. And that basically concludes our takeoff calculation. Now we'd be all set up, and we could go for our dispatch. Quick word here, as we are running along, and that is the runway condition. Now, the OPT offers you quite some interesting manuals over here, especially when you're using the beta version of it. And for example, it has the global reporting format tables or the Talpa matrix. Now, that explaining those would be stuff for a totally different video. But what I want to explain quickly, because we are a little bit limited with the runway conditions that we have available in our simulator. Basically, Microsoft Flight Simulator knows 3 different runway conditions. That's dry, wet, and contaminated. And contaminated basically means snow. So, for our takeoff calculations, dry is dry. That's obvious. A wet runway in your simulator usually becomes good as a runway condition in here. And if you have a contaminated or a snowy runway, select the dry snow numbers. And that's basically the easy way of choosing which runway condition you want to use in Microsoft Flight Simulator. The same applies to a P3D, by the way. I don't know how it works in X-Plane if they make more differences. However, dry for a dry runway, good for a wet runway, and dry snow for a snowy runway. That basically reflects the performance figures in Microsoft Flight Simulator most closely. That basically concludes our, I have to admit, very simplified version of the takeoff performance calculation. The reason I simplified this a little bit is because in Microsoft Flight Simulator you will, be a little bit limited, and I could go into some details in here and make this a very, very long video. However, we are already at 30 minutes or at 33 minutes at the moment I'm saying this. We still have the landing calculation ahead of us, so I don't know where this video is going to end up, probably like 40 minutes or something. So let's continue on and keep it at the simplified version. For your Flight Simulator takeoff performance calculation, this is basically going to be all that you'll need to do it properly. Now, let's go on. Now, we've taken off, we're now in cruise and doing our performance calculation for a landing. We have previously calculated the landing dispatch performance, now we're going to go for the landing en route performance. And, of course, we're going to Palma de Mallorca here, and it's now giving us this META. If you're flying online, check the ATIS over the META. But if you're not flying online, just take the meta values over here, provided that you're using realistic weather in your flight simulator. If you're using a default preset, you'll just have to enter the numbers from the default preset that you know. What you'll notice on the landing en route page is that it has automatically taken over the values that you have entered on the landing dispatch page. So we have already filled out Palma de Mallorca, runway 24 left, 2.5 gradient. The condition is not filled out because, you see, we've calculated dry on the landing dispatch, but things may have changed during the flight, so you will definitely have to re-enter this one. The wind, temperature, and QNH have also been taken in over from the dispatch page, as well as the landing flap setting and some basic selections as the air conditioning and the thrust reversers and the speed brakes. It also shows you your predicted landing weight that has been calculated from the weight and balance tab. And what this means is that on here you are going to be able to see if you have saved any fuel on the flight or not. However, we'll get to that in a moment. First of all, filling out the landing en route page, we check the NOTAMs, MEL, and CDL restrictions. Then we have Palma 24 left, 2.5. Now, it's 28 degrees, no sign of rain anywhere, so it'll be a dry runway. If you're flying online on VATSIM, then you will get the ATIS, which is going to tell you your runway state. For the wind, we have variable at 2 knots in our META. And whenever the wind is variable, we'll always assume it to be a direct tailwind. So variable 2 knots, in the wind page here, just becomes 2 knots of tailwind. And to enter 2 knots tailwind, just go -2 in the wind page, and then it's just taking it as a direct tailwind. So you don't have to figure anything out with the courses or something, just enter -2 and then you'll have it as a tailwind. Also, what can be advisable here, since we always want to calculate conservatively, if they report 2 knots variable wind, then personally I would just go for something like 5 knots of tailwind to give you a little bit more conservative performance figures. Temperature 28 degrees and the QNH is still 1016. For the flaps, we'll have to choose which flap setting we want, and I'm going to guide you through the decision-making process on that in a moment. So, basically, I would always go for a flap 30 landing, because it saves you fuel and the aircraft flies a little bit nicer with flap 30 than it does with flap 40. And when we hit calculate over here, or when we are looking at the airport charts, then we'll see that Palma de Mallorca has 2 exits that are interesting for us on the runway. And that is basically Sierra 1 and Sierra 2. Now we can see on the graphic chart over here, once we have calculated, where our exits are. And in here it's now giving us the different length of runway. And it also tells us where our exits are. Now, interestingly enough, on here I'm not getting Sierra 1 and Sierra 2, but it only starts at Sierra 3. Now, that would be a little bit different on the real one, that would also have Sierra 1 and 2. However, I can tell you that Sierra 2 is approximately 2,000 meters down the runway, and Sierra 1 is approximately 1,400 meters down the runway. So, now, to choose the flap setting that we want to use, we are basically looking at how long is our stopping distance going to be. We can see this very nicely on the graphics page over here, that auto brakes 1 would be overshooting the runway. Auto brakes 2 would stop us just before the end. Auto brake 3 is stopping us just before exit Sierra 3. And we're also getting the numbers in meters over here. And if we look at the non-graphical representation, we're also going to see it over here. So basically, auto brake 3 is 2,297 meters, auto brakes 2, 2,901 meters. And since I said that we do have an exit available at 2,000 meters, which is the preferred exit for us in Mallorca, then of course we have to choose now between auto brakes 3 and auto brake max if we are doing a flap 40 landing. However, here's something to take into consideration. First of all, on a dry runway, the distances you see here are factored with 15%. So that includes an additional safety margin to stop your aircraft on the runway. So if we see 2,297 meters over here, then if we would actually go into a calculator and take 2297 times 0.85 to remove that factoring, then you know your actual landing distance. For legal purposes, you of course have to be within the calculated landing distance over here, so within the 2297. But for actual operational purpose, it is an idea to at least make that calculation and see how much runway you are actually going to need. So if you factor this by 0.85, you end up anywhere around 2,000 meters. And we have this high-speed exit that we want to vacate on the runway at 2,000 meters. So basically, a combination of flap 30 and auto brake 3 would bring us right to that exit. If you wanted to take exit Sierra 1 around at 1,400 meters, then you could do the same with a maximum auto brake up here, and you would end up roundabout with 1,500 meters. And now you have to keep in mind that you have to make a difference between if a runway exit is a rapid exit taxiway, so one that's angled at less than 45 degrees from the runway, that you can enter with up to 55 knots, or if it is a 90-degree exit. And if it's an exit that's angled at 45 degrees or less, so if it's a rapid exit taxiway, or as we usually call it a high-speed exit, then you can subtract approximately 200 meters from the landing distance that you are going to need to the exit. So if we take this further, we take our auto brake 3 setting over here of 2,297, multiply with 0.85, giving us about 2,000 meters, and then we have a high-speed exit, so we subtract another 200. That means we can easily make an exit that's 1,800 meters down the runway, and we'll be able to enter that exit with approximately a good speed to vacate the runway. And that is how we would calculate the auto brake and flap configuration that we want to use on our landings. So, giving you another example. Let's say we want to take exit Sierra 3 up here. Sierra 3 is not a high-speed exit, so we cannot take those 200 meters off, because we'll have to slow the airplane to 10 knots before we can start turning onto the exit. A diagram up here shows us that Sierra 3 is just behind the auto brake 3 setting. Auto brake 2 is too far behind, so what we can do over here is to take either flaps 30 and auto brake 3, and then we'll just have to disconnect the auto brake at some point once we have lost sufficient speed. So for example, when you've reached 80 knots, you could disengage the auto brake and then manually brake the airplane so that you end up right next to Sierra 3 exit. Now, it would be worth the calculation, however, to take auto brakes 2, subtract those 15%, and see how close that is bringing you to the Sierra 3 exit. Because if you're using auto brake 3, your airplane is going to slow down rather quickly, and that means that your runway occupancy time is going to be increased. Whereas if you're using auto brakes 2, and you're going all the way to Sierra 3 exit, then your runway occupancy time is actually going to be less, because you will be faster on the initial stage of the landing roll. And you'll just have to make some calculation there and figure out what suits you best. Now, the next one over here is, of course, we have our air conditioning auto and the eyes off, all brakes, but you could calculate, for example, only for a specific auto brake setting if you wanted to. Automatic speed brake, and then thrust reverse. Do you want to take credit for thrust reverses? By the way, I'm skipping over the non-normal checklist over here because I'm going to cover that a little bit later. But do you want to take thrust reverse credit or not? So, basically, we're talking about a dry runway here. If our runway was wet, then we would actually have different numbers. But we're talking about a dry runway. And on dry runways, the thrust reverser is never taking into account for your stopping distance. However, where it matters very much is the brake cooling schedule. So let's take our earlier decision that we want to vacate on Sierra 2 exit, and we're going to use autobrake 3 for it with a flap 30 landing. That is going to give us 40 minutes of brake cooling time, before which we can consider our next departure. And the brake cooling time starts when you're at the gate, the aircraft is on chocks, and you are releasing the parking brake. So the parking brake has to be released in order for the brakes to cool and meet this cooling schedule. Now we can see we've got 40 minutes over here. We have to be on stand and release a brake in order to do that. So we're looking at least at a 45-minute turnaround if we were to use this setting. Now, many carriers nowadays are planning on a 30 or 35-minute turnaround, with some carriers like Ryanair going as low as 25-minute turnaround. So if you were to use no thrust reverse credit, then your brake cooling would be longer than the planned turnaround time, which would mean that you would have to delay the subsequent flight. Now, we don't want delays. We get enough of them anyway these days. So we can calculate with a reverser all operational. And if we go for that, then all of a sudden, all we need is 8 minutes of brake cooling time, while it is giving us the same landing distance. Now, why is that? That's because on a dry runway, the landing distance is calculated without taking the reverser into account anyway. And even if on the actual landing you are now pulling the reversers, then you are going to get a less strong activation of your auto brake, because the auto brake always aims for the same deceleration. And that means that when the thrust reversers are adding to the deceleration, then the wheel brakes are going to be used less at the same auto brake setting. And the less usage of the wheel brakes obviously means that they are heating up less, so they are not heating up as strong because they don't have to absorb as much energy, and that significantly reduces the brake temperature and therefore the cooling time that you need on the ground. So, as you can see, with the reversers all operational, we only get 8 minutes of brake cooling. So, for this very landing, what I would determine to use is a flap 30 landing, using autobrake 3, and we're going to use second detent reverse thrust. Now a quick word here, as you have seen in my landing tutorial, we are always going to activate the reversers. So no credit basically means idle reverse. You're going to open the thrust reverse but not increase the thrust. So that basically gives you about 21% or 25% of N1 with the reversers unlocked. And if we go for all operational, we are pulling the thrust reverse to about 75%. On the real airplane, there is a detent in there, so you feel that notch on the thrust reversers for 75% reverse thrust, and that is reverse all operational. You can pull it a bit further up to 83% of reverse thrust, but for that you don't have any calculation option, because what the OPT calculates for is always only second detent reverse. So that's how we determine which landing settings we are going to use. Let's quickly talk about a wet runway situation. So let's take braking action good for a wet runway and a flap 30 landing. If we calculate this, actually without the reverse first, we get 2,324 meters of stopping distance. Now, a wet runway calculation always includes those 15% increment, and you may not subtract it for your exit planning. So 2,324. In practical terms, of course, depending on how wet the runway actually is and how good the braking actually is, you may still subtract those 15%, but be careful with it. And you can see 2,323 meters with no reverse credit. Now if I'm taking reversers all operational on a wet runway, you can see that I'm actually getting a little bit less of a stopping distance. Now, if we want to take this to the extremes, and for example we fly on a runway that has a medium braking action, all things unchanged, reversers inoperative or reversers in idle, you will see that auto brake 3 would actually give you 3,026 meters of stopping distance. Now, if I'm taking the reversers on now, so reversers all operational, 2,555 meters. So, as you can see, the worse the runway condition gets, the greater is the effect of the thrust reverser. So, a good runway, which basically is just a wet runway, it has rained a little bit and the runway is wet, but there is, for example, no standing water. Then the reverse hardly makes a difference. But the less friction the wheel brakes get, the greater is the effect of the thrust reverser. And you can clearly see that on this example with the medium runway condition. Now if we were to take this even further, for example we take medium to poor, which is the worst condition that the 737 is allowed to land on. So you may not land at a poor braking action. However, looking at this, with a medium to poor and 5 knots tailwind, no thrust reverse credit, flaps 30, we can actually not stop on the runway. Even maximum manual braking is giving us approximately 579 meters more runway distance required than we actually have available. Now, of course, you can try flap 40 if you see this. But even then, still 375 meters more than we actually need. Now, remember that number for maximum manual braking here, 3375. Now to take the reverse all operational, 2607. So all of a sudden, with the reversers operative, we can actually land on that runway. There is one final thing that I would like to mention here. Let's go back to our original example. We have a dry runway and we have a flap 30 landing with no reverse credit. Actually, we'll take the reverse credit because we need it for brake cooling. Then 2,297 meters. Now, let's go ahead and not subtract those 15% from this number, because obviously for legal purposes, you're not allowed to subtract it. Subtracting that really is only for determining your actual landing distance and therefore planning vacating the runway a little bit better. So we have an exit at 2,000 meters that we want to aim for. And we need 2,297 meters with auto brake 3. And going auto brake max would actually get you to stop quite a bit earlier and significantly increase the brake cooling time. So what we want to do now, in this situation, we can always try flap 40 landing and see what it calculates then. So now at flap 40, it's 2,138 meters. And remember that I told you earlier on that for a rapid exit taxiway, we can assume approximately 200 meters less landing distance. So with a flap 40 landing and these numbers in here, we can then actually vacate the runway without having to, for example, override the brakes. Now, of course, once we've done our performance figures with flap 40, we can also recalculate our reverse credit over here. So if we take no reverse credit now, we'd need 29 minutes of brake cooling, which, if you have a 35-minute turnaround, for example, could enable you to use idle reverse only. And that is going to save you fuel and noise emissions. So, if you have an airport that is very noise sensitive, for example, in Copenhagen, they really don't want you to use thrust reversers more than idle unless you have to for safety reasons. And a brake cooling schedule is not a safety reason because you can always just stay on the ramp a little bit longer and then it'll cool down. So, taking that example, if we calculate a landing distance and we really wanted to use the reversers only in idle, then now using flap 30 we'd end up at 40 minutes of brake cooling time. But if we go to flap 40, then all of a sudden it becomes 29 minutes. So that may be tactical use of your flap setting for the landing, depending on what you actually want to do on the next turnaround. If you were doing the last flight of the day, or if you have a long turnaround of an hour upwards, then of course flap 30 would be the preferred selection because it would simply save fuel and make the aircraft handle a little bit nicer on the approach. But if you have a subsequent sector and the ground time is not too long like it is for most airlines nowadays, then flap 40 might give you a significantly reduced brake cooling time while also reducing your operational landing distance a little bit. So that is the consideration, whether you want to use flap 30 or flap 40 on the landing. Can you make your exit? How long is the brake cooling schedule going to be? And that's how you decide if you want to use flap 30 or 40. Of course, can you make the exit is the far more important thing here over how long is the brake cooling schedule going to be. Because if you overshoot the runway, then the brake cooling schedule won't matter anymore. The thing will have a lot of time when it's lying in a hangar in pieces, while the investigators are taking a look into why you wrecked that aircraft. Alright, there is one final point that we quickly have to talk about, and that is non-normal checklists in here. So, it's 55 minutes into the video. Thank you very much for listening until here. I promise to make this one quick. If we go on non-normal checklist, basically we get a list of all non-normal checklists that require a custom landing calculation. And an example for that may be engine in-op. If we select that, first of all, the missed approach climb gradient field here gets grayed out. So does the air conditioning and the anti-ice fields. And for example, the reason why the missed approach climb gradient is grayed out is because when you're using, or when you are in an engine in-op situation, then a legal requirement applies, and that is far lower than the requirement for a 2-engine go-around. You'll have to choose between your landing flap setting. So with an engine inoperative, we basically always want to use flap 15. And then you have to choose if you want to use thrust reverse credit. Now, if you go ahead, calculate this, then we can basically see already which kind of data it's giving us here. Now, obviously in an engine in-op case, you can disregard the recommended brake cooling schedule because the airplane is going to be on the ground for a long time anyway. And we can see over here which brakes we can use and what kind of landing distances this would give us. Now, whenever you are landing with a non-normal condition, my airline requires us to always multiply the result with 1.3 to determine the runway length that we actually need, or to determine if we can actually land on a particular runway. The other non-normal checklists basically are self-explanatory, and the only reason you would actually select something in here is when you are actually running a non-normal checklist, and the checklist directs you to determine the required landing distance. And what the Boeing QRH always says is determine the landing distance using the performance in-flight chapter in the QRH or other approved source. And the onboard performance tool is such an other approved source. So basically, the name of the non-normal condition you have to select in here is the same as the name for the non-normal checklist in question. So for example, you would have the trailing edge asymmetry non-normal checklist, or trailing edge disagree non-normal checklist, loss of system A and B non-normal checklist, and so on. And there can be quite some significant increase in here. For example, if I take the leading edge flap transit non-normal checklist, the flap indication up here is all of a sudden grayed out because we can not necessarily determine the flap setting we're going to have. And you can see how the runway distance can significantly be increased, or the required landing distance can significantly be increased with some of those non-normal checklists. Now, this actually concludes this video. Thank you very much for staying with me for a long time. If you have further questions, consider joining my Discord channel and ask them in there, or just post them in the comments under the video in here. In any case, if you like the video, consider leaving or hitting that like button, consider leaving a comment and subscribing to the channel. And if you really loved it, there is a small donation link for Buy Me a Coffee in the video comments below. For now, thank you very much for joining. Hope you found this one interesting, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one. Thank you very much, and after staying for almost an hour, this is me signing out, and see you again soon.